So now I'm going to start the topic. Today we are going to discuss about neurological and muscular disorders. Under this heading, we are mainly going to see about poliomyelitis and cerebral palsy. Though both are rare diseases and you hardly observe any case of poliomyelitis and cerebral palsy these days, uh, you have to have some basic idea about these two disorders, and we are going to focus on orthopedic manifestations of these two conditions and what we are going to do for these conditions. Rest of the medical management and diagnosis and everything will be dealt in other subjects like microbiology, general medicine, and pediatrics. Now we are mainly going to focus about the orthopedic manifestations in this session. So, first coming to poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis is an infectious fever which is caused by an enteric virus. It is Picornidae. It belongs to Picornidae family, and most commonly the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, they are affected. So, by this you can make out that mainly the motor function of the muscles is affected because anterior horn cells are affected. So coming to the etiology, they are caused by neurotropic virus, which has affinity to the neurons in anterior horn of spinal cord and for some motor nuclei in the brain. So by this, you can infer that mainly the motor system is involved. Sensory system is not involved in poliomyelitis, and paralysis may be precipitated after a strenuous physical activity or after an intramuscular injection, or if a child is on cortisone therapy because he or she will be in immunocompromised state. Same with tonsillectomy or adenoidectomy or tooth extraction also predisposes to paralysis during polio epidemics. So, coming to the two main pathological changes seen are, one thing is edema and chromatolysis of the motor neuron cells in the anterior horn. And the first change is seen in chromatolysis of the Nissl substance in the cytoplasm. And by this, the corresponding muscles are paralyzed. Actually, here sometimes these muscles are there either completely paralyzed or they're only mildly involved. They gradually recover, and then there will be some regeneration of nerve fibers and the muscles relax from the paralysis. The muscles which are innervated by the nerve will be recovering from the paralysis. Sometimes they're completely involved, completely destroyed. So the muscle which is involved will not be functioning thereafter. So that is the main pathology. Usually here, since the lower motor neuron is affected, the anterior horn cells, that the lower motor neurons, they cause lower motor neuron type of palsy, where you can find flaccid paralysis and some fasciculations, everything can be seen. The tendon reflexes are diminished. So this is the main pathology. However, after some time, the nerves start regenerating, and then they gradually the muscles start recovering. So that is the main pathology. Coming to the nerves part, actually because the disease spreads through fecal-oral route, the virus they get ingested, and then they usually multiply in the lymphoid tissue in the gut, and then they establish themselves in the reticuloendothelial system, and they reach the anterior horn cells either through blood or peripheral nerves. They reach through blood. They reach it. So the peripheral nerves are involved. And now coming to the clinical features, you have the acute stage. In acute stage, in pre-paralytic phase, we have the following symptoms. Initially, there will be some prodromal symptoms like sore throat, which is followed by fever and headache. And there will be sudden onset of neck stiffness, irritability, nausea, and vomiting. All are signs of meningeal irritation. And there will be aching and spasm of the back muscles. And one thing is there is marked tenderness of involved muscles. There will be spasm of the involved muscles. The exact pathology behind the spasm of the muscles is not identified yet, but that is one important thing uh, which is responsible for the deformities. So initially during that period, the muscles should be treated with some physiotherapy. Moist heat should be provided to the muscles. This we are going to see later in the treatment part. When after when these muscles are involved, and when if at all after this point there is complete recovery, it is called non-paralytic poliomyelitis. And then this is the first phase, acute phase, pre-paralytic phase. Then you have the second phase, paralytic phase. In paralytic phase, there will be sudden onset of flaccid paralysis. Because it is a lower motor neuron type, you have flaccid paralysis and asymmetrical paralysis. Both sides are not involved, only one side is involved. Because it depends on the anterior horn cells which are involved, you have asymmetrical paralysis of the muscles of the limb and trunk. Usually, as the fever subsides, it usually occurs after the onset of 2 to 3 days after the onset of fever. It occurs after 2 to 3 days after onset of the fever. And as I told earlier, there is no sensory loss or bowel and bladder involvement. So you have two types of varieties in this paralytic phase. One thing is spinal form, where only the peripheral nerves, the anterior horn cells, they are involved. Whereas bulbar form, in which the cranial nerves are involved. So whenever spinal form is involved, you have the flaccid paralysis of the extremities, where there is hypotonia, loss of reflexes, and then the superficial reflexes, they first disappear. So there will be disappearance of the superficial reflexes, loss of tone, and there will be some fasciculations also, and gradually the muscles will go into wasting, and so that is the paralytic phase. And then usually tibialis anterior has lesser columns of nerves involved, so that muscle gets completely involved usually. The most common muscle which is involved is quadriceps. Gluteal muscles are also involved. And coming to the bulbar forms, cranial nerves are most commonly involved. Since the cranial nerves are involved, there will be different symptoms like nasal intonation and respiratory obstruction, regurgitation of food, and other symptoms will be there. So there we have to be watchful about aspiration of the food and other things. So that we have to be watchful in the patient in paralytic phase. And coming to the recovery stage or convalescent stage, as I told earlier, the nerves, all nerves will not be completely involved. Some nerves are completely damaged, some are partially damaged and they get repaired. As a result, there will be some gradual recovery of the paralyzed muscles with the regeneration of the nerve fibers. Usually, when muscle remains paralyzed for more than 3 months, the chances of recovery are less. And most of the recovery occurs between 3 to 6 months. However, this phase lasts up to 18 months to 2 years. So that is the recovery stage or convalescent stage. Coming to the residual paralysis stage. Please remember this post-polio residual paralysis can be asked as a 2 marks question, or sometimes it was asked as an essay question also. Post-polio residual paralysis and the precautions which we are going to take, everything will be asked. So post-polio residual paralysis is used to indicate the residual paralysis that has occurred after 2 years of onset of the disease. That means we have seen initially certain group of muscles will be involved. Some muscles will be involved like tibialis anterior, quadriceps, some set of muscles will be involved. So as the time progresses, some of the groups of the muscle will gradually recover. So after period of 2 years, some muscles will be totally paralyzed or some will be half recovering like that. So that particular status of muscles which we see after 2 years, that paralysis which is remaining, this is called residual paralytic stage or post-polio residual paralysis. Am I clear? Am I clear about post-polio residual paralysis? So if we are clear, I will continue with the topic. So here, now we have seen that Some muscles have recovered and some muscles did not recover. So first thing is what we are going to see in post-polio residual paralysis. First thing is deformities. Whenever a joint is in movement, there will be one group of muscles which are assisting the movement, and there are another group of muscles which are antagonizing the movement. Suppose in case of knee, if at all the quadriceps function is lost and the hamstrings are functioning, what will happen? There will be flexion deformity of the knee joint because unopposed action of one group of muscles or restricted or paralysis of the opposite group of muscles, there will be some deformity initially. So this deformity, if it gets fixed, that is if you cannot bring it to the neutral position, either passively, then the deformity is said to be fixed. That fixed deformities may occur gradually, or some deformity, though not fixed, dynamic deformities may also be present. So that is one sequelae which we see in the post-polio residual paralysis. And second thing is there will be disuse atrophy of the muscles, because the patient will not put the muscle to the use because there is no nerve supply, and gradually the muscle fibers, they get atrophied. So even if the nerve fibers, they regenerate, then the utility or strength of the muscle will be decreased. So this point please remember. And third thing is there will be shortening of the affected leg, because in the fascial region the muscles, when they get atrophied, the blood supply also will get reduced. As a result, the growth of the bone is also compromised. As a result, there will be shortening of the affected limb. So these are the three conditions which you have to address while treating a case of post polio residual paralysis. So am I clear so far regarding deformities and shortening? So meanwhile, you reply me meanwhile, some of you reply if you have understood or not. Now, once again, I want to summarize the stages. First thing is incubation period, following which you have a pre-paralytic phase where there will be some prodromal symptoms like sore throat, fever, diarrhea, etc. And suppose with that case, it is the disease has recovered and some of the muscles have, start involving, there will be muscle spasm and tenderness will be there. In pre-paralytic phase itself, if the patient has recovered, that is called non-paralytic poliomyelitis. And after that, maximum group of muscles will be involved at certain point of time, that is C. You can see the C line in the graph. This is the stage of maximum paralysis. Then after this period, gradually the muscles start recovering. So this is the maximal point of recovery, you can see somewhere between D. And after that, after E, you have the, between D and E, gradually the recovery has reduced. And after E, there will not be any improvement in the muscle status. So that is the post-polio residual paralysis. Abortive poliomyelitis is one sort where you have just non-specific case of fever, headache, vomiting, and drowsiness. And later on, when we do some spinal CSF analysis, you will find the changes which are related to poliomyelitis. Then you can identify. This is abortive poliomyelitis. Just for completion's sake, I am giving this. So there are few points which I would like to stress. In poliomyelitis, the lower limbs are more commonly involved. Quadriceps is the muscle which is most commonly involved. Most commonly muscle involved is quadriceps. Whereas tibialis anterior undergoes complete paralysis because the number of columns which are supplying the tibialis anterior are less. So the involvement of the muscle will be more. And in hand, Apponens pollicis is the muscle which is most commonly involved. In upper limb, usually shoulder and elbow are more commonly involved. Usually hand muscles are spared. If at all hand is involved, Apponens pollicis is the most commonly involved muscle. But there is one thing which you have to be careful about. In about 10% of patients, there will be involvement of the respiratory muscles. Since spinal nerves are involved, the diaphragm, which is supplied by the phrenic nerve, could be involved. Intercostal muscles, all these muscles can also be involved. And the earliest reflexes to disappear are the superficial reflexes are going to disappear. So these are few important points which I want to stress upon. So here you can see in this picture, there is gross wasting of the muscles. This limb is involved. You can see that there is gross wasting of the muscles. Here, there are some flexion contractures at the knee, and then there is a foot drop or equinus deformity. Equinus deformity at the ankle is present. I am showing it with my cursor. There is equinus deformity here, or foot drop or plantar flexion. The leg is fixed, and then here you have the, because of tight hamstrings, you may have the flexion deformity of the knee. And when the hip flexors are involved, you have the flexion deformity at the hip. In shoulder, usually we find adduction and internal rotation deformity. Thumb also, elbow also, you have the flexion deformity. And one more thing, there is something called iliotibial band, ITB. ITB, it extends from the coccyx, it has attachments to coccyx, iliac crust, and then it inserts along the linea aspera of the femur. So whenever that muscle contracts, there will be numerous deformities, like the pelvic obliquity will be there. And whenever the spinal muscles of one side are involved, there will be obviously bending of the spine towards one side. So the spine will be bent towards one side, and then the pelvic obliquity will be there. And then when the ITB has contracted, there will be external abduction deformity of the hip joint will be there, flexion deformity, and genu valgum will be there. So all these deformities are seen. Depending on the group of muscles involved and the muscles which are contracted, there will be n number of deformities that we are going to see in next slides. So of children who became paralyzed by polio, 30% of the children, they get recovered by in first few weeks or months. Whereas 30% of children have mild paralysis, they can go on with some calipers like orthotics can be used and they'll move on. And 30% have moderate to severe paralysis. And 10%, as I told you, will die because of respiratory paralysis, or when bulbar involvement is there, they may get choked or anything because of loss of deglutition, etc. So they end up with bad prognosis. So here, in each stage, the role of orthopedician in each stage when you are asked to monitor. So in acute stage, first of all, for fever and other things, supportive treatment will be given. And because in acute stage also there will be maximum paralytic phase, there will be some cranial nerve involvement. You have to prevent secondary respiratory tract infections, and aspirations should be prevented. And for treatment of respiratory paralysis, for that we use respirators, and you have to monitor the patient. How do you monitor the patient for respiratory paralysis? Suppose deltoid is involved, C5. Deltoid is supplied by the C5 nerve root, and very close by you have the subphrenic nerve supplying nerve roots, C3, C4, etc. So whenever deltoid is involved or weakness of a shoulder is present, so please be watchful about respiratory paralysis. And also we observe the usage of the accessory muscles, etc. Then respirators, or if necessary, tracheostomy or endotracheal intubation should be done to prevent death because of respiratory paralysis. And we have also seen that there will be muscle spasm in the acute stage. So to prevent that muscle spasm, this moist heat should be provided, and there should be some splinting. Of course, the usage of splinting is controversial. There are some people who do not advocate it, but still splinting can be done, and limbs should be placed in functional position. So what is the use of keeping it in functional position? First thing, by keeping the limb in functional position, you will prevent the formation or occurrence of a deformity. And second thing, even if a deformity occurs, because it is in a functional position, the patient can be managed. Rehabilitation will be easy. So, for example, you should we'll see it in the subsequent slides how the patient should be placed. And then coming to the next stage, recovery stage. So whenever the muscles are slowly recovering, the patient should be helped by using passive movements of the different joints. Either elbow, knee flexion and extension should be done passively, and hydrotherapy. And sometimes these children are placed in a tub of water, which I'll show you in the next slide, called Harvard's bath, where there will be saline water or warm water or salt soaked water will be there, so that the muscles which are in spasm, they get soothed. There will be soothing action. And you also use different orthoses to prevent the deformities. Then one has to assess the muscles serially. So I'm sure all of you know about the MRC grading, the power of the muscle. Can any one of you tell? I will unmute you if any one of you is interested to tell that. Or tell me if you know MRC grading or not. 0, muscle grading, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 full power, against resistance, that movement. That I'm not going to tell now. All of you read, and then some of you text me in the next class if you don't. So that MRC grading, you see it in neurological examination in general medicine, and even in peripheral nerve injuries also, that MRC grading will be used. So that MRC grading for the nerves will be there. According to that grading, the power of the muscles is assessed serially. That is the recovery stage. Then coming to the next stage is residual paralysis. So in residual paralysis, our goal is to correct the deformity. I mean, you have to attempt to make the best use of the muscles which are available. For that, we have to correct the established deformities. And second thing, you have to improve the muscle balance. And third thing is stabilization of joints. So these are the 3 guiding principles. And one more thing is also there. I'll tell it later. So first, in case of respiratory muscle involvement, so watch for signs of bulbar palsy or respiratory muscle involvement. In such conditions, sedatives are contraindicated, because if you give sedatives, there may be respiratory depression also. So do not give sedatives in such conditions. Usually this is seen in acute phase where there will be muscle spasm. So in order to relieve the muscle spasm, do not give sedatives. Then Trendelenburg position is preferred. When there is head-on position, the pressure on the diaphragm will be increased from the abdominal contents. So there will be some stimulus for the diaphragm for respiratory breathing, for respiratory drive. And even the bronchial secretions and other things will also be drained. There will be some oscillatory beds also in certain hospitals. Those are also used. And tracheostomy, endotracheal intubation, and respirators may also be used. So these are different steps which we take in case of respiratory muscle involvement. And coming to the orthopedic management, we have seen that you have to position the patient in functional position. So you have to help in relaxing of the paralyzed muscle and stretching of the spastic muscles slowly. And the patient should be kept on a firm surface. He should not be kept in a slouched position. So beneath the mattress, wooden boards are kept. So over that, the patient should be made to sleep. Then the footboard should be padded. Footboard is at the end of the bed. When you have the footboard which is padded, so that the ankle is stabilized like this. I'm showing it with my hand. I hope all of you can see it. So this is, assume it to be the end of the bed, and this is foot. So you have to put it in neutral position like this. Otherwise, what happens? Like this, gradually equinus deformity will develop, because of the gravity, the foot will fall like that. If the tibialis anterior is not strong, so you have to put it like this, and you have to see that the heel is free from the mattress, because otherwise some bed sores and calluses will be formed. So like this, the foot should be placed in dorsiflex or neutral position. The foot should be placed. And then standing reflexes also stimulated. Gradually using orthotics, the patient is encouraged to stand. And whenever you are placing a patient in his functional positions, the hip should be kept in abduction and neutral rotation. If adductors are involved, the hip will go into adduction deformity. And knee is kept in slight flexion with small rolls beneath it to prevent posterior subluxation of tibia and occurrence of genu recurvatum deformity. Ankle, as I told earlier, should be kept in neutral position. So, principles of surgical management. First thing is restoration of muscular balance. Second thing is correction of deformities. Third thing is stabilization of unstable joints. And fourth one is equalization of the limb lengths. So we have seen earlier that there will be shortening of the limb. Whenever you have this question of post polio residual paralysis, you have to write the definition and the point before 2 years. The 2 years point is very important. You have to mention the time span, and then what are the challenges which we are going to face, or what are the issues we have to address in post polio residual paralysis, like deformities, shortening, disuse atrophy, contractures. These four things are the issues which should be addressed. So write those four things. And after that, principles of treatment is restoration of muscle balance, correction of deformities, stabilization of unstable joints, and equalizing the limb length. These are the goals of surgical management. So this one, Habbart's bath, which I told you earlier. And here, see, different deformities. See, this is the flexion contracture of the knee with valgus deformity of the knee here. And there is flexion and abduction contracture of the hip joint. And see, the different deformities of the foot are seen. And then here there is equinus at the ankle joint. Because the patient is not ambulant and has been crawling, there will be some calluses formed across the knee joint, or wherever the bony point where the pressure is being laid. So coming to the different deformities and surgeries. Most commonly in hip we see the flexion, abduction and external rotation deformity, for which the surgeries, there are many surgeries which are beyond the scope of your subject at present, but these surgeries are mentioned in your textbook, Maheshwari and Natarajan. These surgeries are present, mentioned, names are given. So for hip you do the Sauter's release, and for and Yuan's procedure. What these procedures are, I will just tell you for your understanding. And then for knee, whenever there is a flexion deformity of knee, when there is a flexion deformity of knee, what the posterior cut structures will be contracted. Hamstrings therefore should be lengthened, and posteriorly the capsule should be released. Posterior capsulotomy. So please remember these procedures. And because you just remember, because in flexion deformity, suppose you have elbow flexion here, what will happen? The anterior structures will contract. Same way in flexion deformity of knee, the posterior structures will be contracted. So you release the posterior structures, thereby relieving the flexion deformity of the knee. Same way in ankle, when you have an equinus deformity, you will do TA lengthening, tendo-achilles lengthening will be done. That is one of the procedures for equinus deformity. And in foot, you have a cavus deformity. For that, Stiedler's release is seen. What these releases are, I will show you in the next slide. So this is Ober-Sion's procedures. I am showing it with the cursor, where in the attachments of sartorius, rectus femoris, gluteus medius and minimus, and then iliopsoas tendon are detached. So these attachments are released, so that the contractures, the flexion contracture and abduction contracture are relieved. So this is one of the procedures. In Yuan's procedure, there is another procedure where laterally at the distal femur, the ITB is released. So that is one more procedure. And coming to the Sauter's procedure, where the flexors of the hip are released superiosteally from their original position and they're allowed to slip into the pelvis. So the flexion deformity of the hip is relieved. Then if the hip is, imagine, suppose the hip is completely flexed, how can the patient walk? Because he cannot keep the feet legs plantigrade on floor. So you have to relieve all the deformities which impede the patient to walk. You're going to restore him, you're going to rehabilitate him. So that is the main purpose of correcting the deformities. So here when there is hip deformity, flexion deformity, you will release the flexion deformity. Remember, suppose the knee is in flexion deformity, how can he walk without extending the knee? So you will address the flexion deformity of the knee. Same way, if there is equinus, there will be again high stepping gait or something. So even that deformity should be corrected so that the patient will have a reasonably good gait, or at least will be able to walk with help of some assistive devices or anything. So that is the main principle behind addressing these deformities. So coming back to the Surter's operation, here the flexors of the hip are stripped superiosteally and they are allowed to slip into the pelvis. So in order to maintain that position, hip spica is applied where the hip is present in hyperextended and adducted position for 2 to 3 weeks. How do you apply hip spica in case of DDH or any other condition? Can somebody answer? So today in today's session, I have asked 2 questions. So when we start our next session, you please answer those 2 questions. One thing is MRC grading and the position of application of hip spica in DDH. So that is Sauter's operation we have discussed. And for genu recurvatum, you see here, this is the Irwin's osteotomy, where a wedge of bone is removed from tibia and the distal portion is fixed to this proximal portion. So the recurvatum deformity is corrected. Then coming to the Steinler's disease, where in this picture you can see the longitudinal plantar ligament. Whenever there is some cavus deformity of the foot, when there is some longitudinal ligament like this, when this ligament is released, gradually there will be correction of the cavus deformity. So that is done for cavus deformity of the foot. Assume it to be cavus deformity, and suppose there is some taut ligament here. The pen, assume the pen to be a taut ligament. When this ligament is released, gradually the cavus deformity will also get released. So that is the concept of Steinler's release. So one thing which I want to tell you is, so in case of these releases, different structure, tendon releases and other things, if it is a dynamic deformity, you will do it. If there is muscle imbalance, if there is increased activity of certain muscle, you will do it. Suppose in case there are static deformities or fixed deformities, what will you do? You have to either stabilize the joint. So in order to stabilize the joint, you will do orthodesis. Orthodesis is fusion of unstable joints. That is another thing. And first thing is, for restoration of muscle balance, we will do tendon transfers. The concept of tendon transfers is, suppose if there is some foot drop is there. So in foot drop, the tibialis anterior is completely gone and tibialis posterior is functioning. Then what will you do? Gradually, you will assess the muscles which are functioning and then transfer the insertion of that functioning muscle in the place of the paralyzed muscle, so that it will gradually take over the action of the paralyzed muscle. So that is the tendon transfer. That is the principles of tendon transfer, which you have seen in peripheral nerve injuries also, like Jones transfer, etc. for wrist drop and other things. So here also, in case of foot drop like this, you can use either tibialis posterior or peroneus group of muscles for restoration of the dorsiflexion. So that is the tendon transfer. And one thing which is important is, whenever you transfer a muscle from its original place to the new place, the power of the muscle will be reduced by one step. So if you transfer a muscle of grade 2, there will not be any use because all it is of no use. Suppose if it is in grade 4, at least it will go to grade 3. So that is why the assessment of muscles of power is important to design the muscle transfer, tendon transfers. And correction of deformities is by different osteotomies, which is also beyond the scope of discussion right now. And coming to the equalization of limb length. When there is one limb is short, after a certain period, in the growing limb, the physis is epiphysiodesis, that is the physis is fused, either temporarily or permanently, depending on the condition, that physis is fused, so that there will not be any limb length discrepancy. So these are the different principles of surgical management. So now I'm going to show two pictures. So here, I'm sure all of you recognized who she is and from which movie it is taken. So can you tell the gait? So, no, somebody at least answer. What is the gait? Or at least who she is and from which movie this picture has been taken. Somebody please message, reply. Whether you know or don't know, also please reply. Anyway, now I'm going to second picture. So here, okay, I'll tell you. So this one is hand to knee gait. Hand to knee gait, where there is paralysis of the quadriceps during the gait. The patient, because the quadriceps mechanism is absent to extend the knee while keeping the leg down. The patient manually pulls the knee up or presses the knee and then proceeds with the gait. So this is the hand to knee gait, which is seen in paralysis of the quadriceps muscle. So this is hand to knee gait. It is seen in different conditions where quadriceps is paralyzed. It's seen in polio. And then this is this gluteus maximus gait, the second picture. This is the gluteus maximus gait. Here, since the gluteus maximus is paralyzed, to maintain the center of gravity across the hip joint, the trunk is swayed back. So that is the gluteus maximus gait. So when we discuss gait, we can discuss it in detail, but I just wanted to emphasize when certain group of muscles are paralyzed, certain patterns of gait are seen. When quadriceps is gone, you have the hand to knee gait. Gluteus maximus is gone, you have the gluteus maximus gait. When there is foot drop or equinus deformity, then you have a high stepping gait. There will be high stepping gait is present. And then coming to, see, if the abductors of hip is gone, you have the Tredelenburg gait. So these are the different gaits which you see. So whenever a polio patient comes, depending on how he is walking, you can make out which group of muscles are lost. So this is all about poliomyelitis. So if I'm clear, I'll continue with the next topic. And one more important thing is regarding prevention. Polio, three varieties of polio virus varieties are there. So any one of them can cause the paralytic poliomyelitis. So prevention is the best modality. Vaccination, which will be dealt in community medicine as well as pediatrics, it will be dealt in detail. So I just want to mention it here. So this is all about poliomyelitis. Then coming to the next condition, cerebral palsy. And by the way, for your interest, I am telling that movie, that picture of Nitya Menon is taken from movie Ganga. So coming to cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy or Little's disease is a non-progressive neurological disorder of children affecting the locomotor system. And coming to the etiology, prenatal conditions, there will be genetic factors, prematurity and maternal infection with torches, etc. And coming to the birth conditions, that if there is any cerebral anaxia or birth trauma also. And postnatal, such some infections like encephalitis, which cause cerebral damage. All these things, they come under etiology for cerebral palsy. So coming to the classification, spastic type, which is the most common type, and it is associated with damage to the cerebral cortex. In spastic type, there will be increased muscle tone and exaggerated reflexes. And coming to the next variety, when basal ganglia is involved, you have the ethetoid type of variety where there will be involuntary movements of hands and legs. With cerebellar involvement, you have the ataxic type of cerebral palsy. In rigid type, there is constant, the muscles remain in constant state of contraction. And in mixed type, it has features of different types like spastic, ethetotic, or ataxic varieties. So coming to the, depending on the part of the part involved, you have the following types. One is quadriplegia, where all four limbs are involved. In diplegia, where predominantly lower limbs are involved compared to the upper limbs. And then hemiplegia, where one side of the body is involved. Here the upper limb is more predominantly involved than the lower limb. In triplegia, three limbs are involved. In monoplegia, one limb is involved. So broadly, this is the classification, depending on the parts involved, parts of the body which are involved. Usually in cerebral palsy, a child of about 1 to 4 years is brought to us, complaining about inability to walk. And one differentiating feature between poliomyelitis and cerebral palsy is the IQ of the children is normal in poliomyelitis. Whereas in cerebral palsy, there will be certain group of children who have lesser IQ. The mental development is also not appropriate or approximate to the age. There will be history of delayed milestones. And there will be persistence of primitive reflexes, which you see in pediatrics like Morose reflex, parachute reflex, etc., etc. So that will be dealt in pediatrics in detail. So these are some of the clinical features. And the symptoms may also be varying between mild to severe. In mild cases, the IQ of the child is reasonably good and the child is ambulant without support. That is, the patient can move on without any assisting devices. Usually they are detected by some spasticity in their lower limbs. Adductor spasm at the hips is most commonly seen. And when you want to adduct the hip, there will be resistance. And in feet, you have equine spasm. Dorsiflexion of the foot becomes difficult. And coming to different deformities and other clinical features, in lower limbs, most commonly adduction of hips is seen. As a result, you see a scissoring gait. And then there will be flexion at the knee joints and equinus at the ankle joints. Because of the muscular imbalance, there will be different deformities like valgus deformity of femoral neck and external tibial torsion. That is, there will be a mechanical axis which will be going along the axes of the bone. In external tibial torsion, the tibia will be slightly rotated outwards. So that is the external tibial torsion. In simpler terms, I am trying to explain the term torsion. And then, as we have seen, there will be scoliosis because one group of muscles will be in spasm. There will be some scoliosis, and hip subluxation will also be there because of the muscular imbalance. And coming to the clinical features, because usually pyramidal tracts are mostly involved, usually knee and ankle jerks are exacerbated, clonus is seen, and plantar response is also extensive. And upper limbs, as I told earlier, will be held in adduction, internal rotation at shoulder joints, flexion at elbow, and forearm in pronation, and flexion at the wrist joint. Thumb is here, the thumb is drawn into the palm, and fingers are flexed at the MCP joint. So this is the deformity of hand which is seen. So this is the scissoring gait, where one leg will be uh, obstructing the other leg, and see the adduction deformity at the hip joint. So in this X-ray, you can see the increased neck shaft angle. This is the line passing across the femoral neck. So the neck shaft angle has increased. This is coxa valga. If the neck shaft angle has decreased, it is coxa vara. This is for your information I'm telling. Here you can see coxa valga. See here, the femoral head is not present in the acetabulum because of the paralytic dislocation of the hip. And the head is also, see, there is one thing which we have already seen in dysplastic hip. Unless the femoral head is in acetabulum, there will be something called femoroacetabular plasticity. Unless the head is in the femoral in the acetabular cavity, the shape of the head will not be maintained or will not be formed. So since it has got subluxated, the morphology of the head is also lost here. And then coming to the management. Here, the management of cerebral palsy, our goal is to achieve maximum functional ability and skill that the patient can acquire. In mild cases, where the IQ is good, we have to correct the deformities and make them ambulant and make them fit to go to school, so that they can they can have education and lead their life. In moderate cases, you try to teach them something. There will be special schools where you will be sent. Some orthotics will be given to deal with the deformity. Orthotics are some assisting devices which are used. That we will see in the next subsequent classes, where orthotics and prosthetics will be dealt, if not trainable. Then in severe cases, you have to educate the patient to take so that he will be able to take care of himself, and activities of daily living like washing, cleaning, etc. can be done by the patient himself. So these are the our management goals in mild, moderate, and severe cases. So this is a classification system where you will grade the functional ability of the child. Here in the first picture, you can see that the child can walk or run without limitation, but there will be reduced speed or coordination. In the level 2, you can see there are some deformities, flexion at the knee joint like that. So the patient will be able to walk indoors slowly, sometimes using assistive devices. See here, more groups are involved. So unless without assistive mobility devices, the patient cannot walk. And here the child is completely confined to a wheelchair. Here in the fifth level, the child is floppy. He cannot even maintain the trunk upright without support. So these are the different gross motor and functional classification system by which you can assess the motor function status of a person or a child. So here also there will be muscle spasms which are treated with Botox or botulinum toxins, which are given at the neuromuscular junctions. Sometimes baclofen is a skeletal muscle relaxant. Sometimes it is also given intrathecally to relieve the skeletal muscle spasms. Coming to the rehabilitation, first thing, to prevent the occurrence of contractures, the passive and active range of motion of the different joints should be encouraged. And coming to the occupational rehabilitation, certain repetitive movements are trained to the patient, and based on that, some vocational activity is allotted. And special education like speech therapy or intellectual IQ development, certain exercises are also given. Sometimes the nerve roots, dorsal nerve roots, which take the impulses from the spastic muscles, they are also ablated. So that is the selective posterior rhizotomy, which is another modality of treatment. And once again, coming to the surgical management, as I told, our aim is to correct deformities and stabilize the joints. These surgeries are usually done in between 4 to 8 years. Commonly done surgical procedures are tendon lengthening, as we have seen earlier in ankle deformity. Suppose this is a foot drop or plantar flexor deformity. You will lengthen the tendoachilles. When you lengthen the tendoachilles, this deformity gets corrected. Same thing, tenotomy, the tendons are released. And tendon transfer operations, which we have discussed earlier, are done to improve the muscle balance. For example, we have seen that there will be some pronation deformity or at the forearm and flexion deformity of the wrist. Then you will remove, if you transfer the pronator teres to the wrist extensor, this pronation deformity will be corrected, as well as the flexion deformity of the wrist will also be corrected. So this is one example which is given in Natarajan textbook. I quoted here. There are numerous examples which are specific for each joint. And then obturator neurectomy. In cerebral palsy, we have seen that there will be adductor spasm. So obturator nerve, which supplies to the adductor muscles, the neurectomy is done. So that is one thing. Stabilization of joints. Whenever there is flexion deformity, or for example, I am telling if there is some flexion deformity of the ankle joint, it's plantar flexion or in equinus position, fixed equinus position, you will try to do different surgeries like Lambronidis procedure, triple arthrodesis. Different procedures are there, which are beyond the scope of discussion right now. And for correcting this thumb deformity, thumb in palm deformity and flexion at the MCQ joints, different surgeries like Matev's procedure. Please remember the name. Matev's procedure and this thenar muscle release or FPL tendon lengthening. All these things are different procedures done to relieve the thumb deformity. So this is all about, in brief, about cerebral palsy and poliomyelitis. Am I clear? So I have texted my email ID in the chat box. So if you have any doubt, please mail your queries to the email ID. So before we meet in the next class, when we meet in the next class, please tell me about the MRC grading, any one of you. You can also text it to my email ID and MRC grading and position of hip while applying hip spica in DDH. So these are few things you have to do. And somebody please respond if you have understood this lesson or not. If you have any queries also, please tell me. So if you have understood and it's okay, we'll end the session. I want somebody to reply, please.